general is literally this idea of what is a post-World War II going to look like. You have, on one side, you have the Russians with the Soviet Union saying, we want it to look like this. And then we have the Allied countries coming together and saying, we want it to look more democratic. Maybe communism is going to spread under the Soviet Union. And that's kind of a big, point of emphasis. As far as, other things go, we took a look last class at the differences between capitalism and communism. I know that it was kind of boring, but that's what we need to know. It's the basis of a lot of this stuff. We're seeing here it's the basis of a lot of irritation in the Cold War. It's the basis of what we're going to talk about with like Potsdam. So it's important to see like where these two countries are coming from, with the Soviet Union and the US, and then other allied countries as well. What is one thing that we know about the allied countries as a whole? What kind of governments did they usually have? Any idea? Were they more authoritarian or totalitarian, or what were they more like? Yeah, democratic, right? They're usually pretty democratic. That being said, obviously, there's a little bit of like tension always, even throughout the war with the Soviet Union, because they're far more on the spectrum of communism, and they're definitely, holding that down a lot more than the U.S. would be. So, something to keep in mind. So as we talk a little bit more about communism, we see this classless society, something that is achieved. You get this communist utopia, this thing that Karl Marx is talking about a lot. He thinks that it's going to work out so well, in fact, that there will be no classes in society. There's no division that should lead to things like less discrimination. And then eventually there should be no government at all, is the kind of idea. However, what we find instead, which ironically with communism, is that you have a way heavier governmental influence on a lot of this stuff. So yes, the goal is eventually, classless society, no government needed. But we also find that, communism doesn't really work unless there's zero corruption. And you'll find throughout history, throughout, all these different communist countries, in capitalistic countries, in any country, there almost always seems to be some form of corruption. So, yes, this is the ideal, but do countries ever really make it there? No, we haven't really experienced a communist utopia, and I'm pretty hesitant to say that we'll ever really get there. As far as communism goes, it is a system of government, that we usually have associated with it would be totalitarian. So you see that with the Soviet Union, you see that with many communist countries today. Usually you're seeing that the property is owned by the state. How is that different than capitalism? What's the difference there? Who's the property owned by in capitalism? Privately owned, right? So in capitalism, you own a house. Can you have the deed to that land eventually? You buy it, right? Yeah, you can. You own a car. You have the title to that car. Yes, you own that vehicle. What you're seeing in communism is that, you may have a home, you may live in a home, but it's probably going to be owned by the state, and it's probably going to be given to you by the state, so you don't really have that much choice in like where you live. It's not to say you shouldn't be grateful to have a home anyway, that's nice, but you don't have that individualized freedom that you see with capitalism a lot. No free enterprise, okay? No free enterprise. We're basically just saying that, there's a large amount of control from the government on the economy. Wealth distributed equally. With that, we're basically, we're aimed at eradicating this rich get richer problem. We're also aimed at getting rid of classes, right? That is one of the things that we're looking to get rid of if you are in the communist mindset. Education and healthcare provided by the state. There's pros and cons to that, obviously. Press controlled and owned by the state. If you look at the United States, we're probably looking at that and like it's a little bit gag-inducing, considering we're all about our First Amendment freedom of speech, right? So looking at this, you're seeing that you're probably not going to see a lot of people criticizing the communist government. You're probably not going to see a lot of people criticizing the Soviet Union during this time. Reason being is because that stuff's not going to make it off the presses. You might have like a black market for that. You may have people sharing that stuff illicitly, but you're not going to have the state, media putting out any ideas that, Stalin is bad or that communism isn't really working. Again, we're looking to get this classless society, so all members of society should be considered equal. So that means, no distinction between wealth, no distinction between, your income, your education, your culture. Marx is thinking that the primary purpose of government as a whole is to basically repress the lower classes in the interest of the ruling classes. So that's part of the reason why Marx hates, this idea of government eventually. Obviously you have communism is all, all in on huge governmental control, but the idea is eventually that there will be no government. So it's obviously this kind of like in-between point. So that is why it would make sense that Marx has this goal of a classless society, this goal of a governmentless society at some point, okay? And then finally, focus is on the progress of the community as a whole. That's incredibly different from capitalism, because with capitalism, you have, an individualistic sense of everything. Your focus is on the individual. Oftentimes people talk about capitalism as like how can I amass as much wealth as I want? How can I earn as much money as I possibly can? In communism, you're not having a Jeff Bezos, you're not having Bill Gates. You might not even have you're not even gonna have somebody who's like making $500K a year for the most part, right? You're not going to have these differences between, lawyers and doctors and teachers and garbage workers and post office people. It doesn't matter. The idea is that a lot of this wealth is distributed equally. And that obviously comes with its pros and cons, some stuff that we talked about last class. As far as ideology goes, people need one another, right? It's a nice sense of community. We rely on each other. It's not your society, it's our society. It's not your agricultural products that you're selling to everybody, it's our agricultural products. When people work together as equals, they achieve greater things. What we're seeing here is kind of a direct opposite to what we saw in capitalism. If you remember, in capitalism, the idea is that, this incentive for money, this creation of, plenty of different companies like AT&T, Verizon, competition drives innovation is the idea in capitalism. Here, the idea is like, hey, we don't need competition. We want to work together. If we work together, we'll achieve something greater. So it kind of throws out the idea of competition, innovating, all that stuff for, something that is a little bit more like sunshine and rainbows, I would say, in some of its approaches. No one should have more than anyone else. I can get on board with that to some extent. It'd be nice on paper. Again, we talk about this stuff. A lot of these things don't always sound awful, right? Especially, you're especially going to look at this. And one of the big reasons why the Allied countries get so worried is that communism appeals heavily to maybe countries that are going through a rough time, right? And you see that after World War II, a lot of countries are going to look at this and say, no one should have more than anyone else. We're going to work together as equals. We need one another. Let's do communism, right? And that's kind of the idea that we see with a lot of these countries. And there's a fear that this is going to spread, right? So, again, doesn't sound bad. Everybody's needs are equally important. Sounds nice, right? Whether or not it works out, that's a whole different story. But on paper, some of this stuff doesn't sound too awful. Government should make sure that everyone's needs are being met. Again, why not, right? Most people would look at that and say, okay, I can kind of get on board with that. But there are other things that people get wary of, a central control of the economy, going away from things like laissez-faire, huge governmental control. One of the other things that people worry about a lot is losing their individualism, losing individual rights, losing their right to criticize the government. All these other things, where there is like one decent thing about a lot of this stuff, you can probably find a flurry of other things that you're probably going to look at and say, I don't know if I quite agree with that. And that's kind of the case with a lot of this. So, society working together, everything's going great. The government's our best friend, basically. And, it's directly opposite of the capitalist ideologies of laissez-faire and everything like that. So what you need to know with this, what is the difference between communism and capitalism as far as the economy goes? What do we see with communism? More involvement or less involvement by the government in the economy? Is the government more involved with capitalism or less involved? Less, right? More kind of hands-off, laissez-faire. In communism, as far as the economy goes, is the government all in or are they just like hands-off? What did I just say? All in, right? They're all in. The government's completely controlling a lot of this stuff. The government has a heavy amount of influence in it. What is the difference between communism and capitalism as far as government goes? Is communism usually a democratic thing? No, right? I see a head shake there. Thank you. It's usually not a democratic thing. Oftentimes you'll find it to be a totalitarian thing, maybe authoritarian regimes. Capitalism is usually democratic. Communism is usually more authoritarian or totalitarian. So let's get into some of the stuff that is a little bit more interesting in regards to, the Cold War in general. So we have this thing. It's called the Yalta Conference, February 1945. So World War II has ended. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, they meet. They're discussing the post-war world. That's where a lot of these issues come from in regards to, can you guys see this? Should I turn off the lights? Turn the lights off? You guys see? Okay, yeah. All right. So a lot of the issues following World War II is about like what Europe is going to look like, right? What is Europe going to look like? What do we get from our victories? The victor goes and spoils the war. The Soviets are asking those questions. The U.S. is asking those questions. Everybody involved is kind of asking those. But Germany's asking what his post-World War II Europe going to look like, right? Italy's asking those questions. Everybody's interested, right? So we have the Yalta Conference. It's said that Poland is going to be governed by the communist government set up, but only until the Soviets have the chance, basically, to hold a free election. Spoiler alert, doesn't really go that way. All right, so that's the idea. Hey, Poland's going to be set up, and this government is going to be communist. You guys did a lot over there, Soviets. This is our way of compromising with you. They'll stay communist until you can do a free election. And then, maybe they want to stay communist, maybe they don't. Whatever they're feeling, whatever they're with, that is up to them. Unfortunately, in the grand scheme of things, you see that the Soviets don't really keep their promise. They don't really allow free elections. So when Germany invades Poland, their government leaders fled to Britain. Okay, so Poland's like free of government leaders during World War II. Then in 1944, the Soviets drive back the Germans. They use their influence to set up a communist government. So it's like Poland was basically free territory at that point. So the Soviets came in and they were like, all right, we liberated this place again. We're going to put up a communist government. You guys are going to love it. It's going to be great. And we're all going to be best friends. It's kind of the idea. All right. So both governments are basically now following World War II, claiming the right to govern Poland. Those officials that fled to Britain are like, hey, hang on. We're still the Polish government. We still kind of control this stuff. Like, thanks for getting our land back, but, we're going to come back home now, right? It's kind of the idea. One's communist, one's non-communist, so you can see where there might be some tension there. And then you have, the Soviet agenda that you're going to see much more clearly later on when we start talking about the Iron Curtain. You'll see why the Soviets are like, I think we're going to keep Poland and we're just going to do whatever we want. And that's kind of what kind of goes on here. Roosevelt and Churchill argued that Poland should have the right to choose its own government. Again, you can see very clearly that the irritation that's going to come up is going to be between democracy and communism, right? It's going to be a very central focus to play in the idea of the Cold War. A lot of this stuff that you're going to see is like FDR or, eventually Truman. You have these people are going to be like, hey, I think that democracy should probably prevail in these areas. We don't really want communists spreading. It's not really our thing, right? That's what you're going to see. A lot of this stuff is going to be centered around that. And then when you get into like the Red Scare and everything else in that nature, you're going to have a lot of fear of communists spreading to like the United States or other areas in Europe. It's a huge kind of a huge theme for this time period. So Roosevelt and Churchill argued that Poland should have the right to choose its own government. Stalin argued that the Soviet Union needed a friendly government at its western border to prevent future invasions. He's literally claiming, he's like, this is a matter of life and death. We need Poland, and it needs to be communist. Otherwise, we're going to die, is what he's basically saying. Potentially a little dramatic, but he's getting a point across, right? He's showing that he's all in on this. He's not backing down. He really does mean business. On the flip side of things, there's the Declaration of Liberated Europe, which gave people the right to choose their governments. You can kind of see it's like it's like France Britain and the United States are like the kids at the lunch table, and they're kind of like kicking Stalin and the Soviets away, right? They're like, we all love democracy and Stalin loves communism. This guy isn't really cool enough to sit with us. It's kind of what you're seeing a lot of these things happening. Because you'll see right here, issued the Declaration of Liberated Europe, which gave the people the right to choose their governments. So you're seeing that you have the majority of the allies are setting up something that probably fits their own agenda. It's important to keep in mind that there are two agendas at play here. One more democratic, one more communist. You can see why, if this is your thought process as Stalin, you're probably getting pretty irritated by a lot of this stuff. But looking at the makeup of the allies, it's like 3 votes to 1. So obviously a lot of this stuff is going to go in their, the democratic direction. So something to not look over. So the Declaration of Liberated Europe gave the people the right to choose their own governments. Obviously, that is in line with a more democratic institution. This asserted the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live. People would be able to create the democratic institutions by their choice, which is a quote coming from that declaration right there. So they're literally saying in the declaration, like, the democratic institutions of your choice, like not the communistic institutions of your choice, okay? So we see that there's definitely an emphasis on a lot of that. Next, Germany would be divided into 4 zones that would be controlled by Britain, France, Soviet Union, and the U.S. So the Soviets are still involved in that. And then finally, Stalin also demanded that Germany pay heavy reparations for war damages. Roosevelt is arguing that the reparations should be based on Germany's ability to pay, and that Stalin should agree to use trade goods as reparations instead of cash. This is going to be a major point of tension, right? Stalin is like, again, all in. Like, Germany needs to pass back. We have a lot of infrastructural issues right now. Obviously, they had the Battle of Stalingrad. You have Leningrad. You have all these different things going on. Their country's taken a decent, hit. Something to keep in mind, I think, too, with why this might be a point of tension, you have to remember that we're not having battles on U.S. soil. We do have the attack on Pearl Harbor, but for the most part, looking at World War II, Europe is ravaged. The Pacific can be seen as ravaged, and the United States is kind of just like, yeah, we're still good, right? Because there's not a bunch of battles happening in Kansas, okay? There's a lot of stuff happening in Europe. Stalin is obviously looking at this and saying, like, hey, Germany's kind of the ringleader of a lot of this stuff. I think that they should pass back. Does anybody know why there might be another reason why we're a little bit, and this goes back to kind of what fed into World War II, why might we be hesitant to make Germany just be completely destroyed economically? Literally, right? Looking at the Treaty of Versailles, FDR, part of it is probably him looking at this and saying, hey, I don't think that we should make the same exact mistake that we made with the Treaty of Versailles, right? I don't think that it's a good idea to cripple Germany, right? A lot of the emphasis following World War II was actually, it's almost like a PR campaign of like, how can we make Germany seem a little bit better, right? There's like a little PR campaign that happens for their citizens. Basically, a lot of people go around and they're like, hey, German people aren't the bad guys. The Nazi party is the bad guys, right? So there's a shift in thinking. And we do see this a lot with the reparations as well. We see here, we got this map. This is the division. This is the way a lot of things are divided. You'll see eventually what we're going to see later on is another map as well that kind of shows the Iron Curtain that we're getting at. But what you should know here is you should basically just know that at this point in our story, World War II is concluded. Plans are being made about the future of Europe. There's a lot of tension between the U.S. and the Soviets about the future of like Germany as well, and the future of Poland. We have 2 powerful nations that are struggling to meet a lot of compromises. One's pushing forth a communist agenda. One is pushing forth a democratic agenda, and also potentially a capitalist agenda in the lands that they're trying to occupy. So it's not that it's all the Soviets. The U.S. has an agenda as well to push, but obviously, for the most part, we kind of look at this and, we characterize a lot of this stuff by their back and forth throughout the next 40 or so, 50 or so years. So who controlled East Berlin? we see on here that East Berlin is controlled by the Soviets, and then who is controlling West Berlin? We also see here that West Berlin is controlled by the Western Allies. So again, there's just another example of kind of division between the Western Allies and then the Soviets, right? It's again kind of the situation of like the Soviets don't quite fit the vibe of the rest of the group is basically what's happening. So who has control of the East? Soviets. Who has control of the West? Western Allies, the US, right? France, Britain. What we're seeing is a lot of poor economies, right? So following World War II, European nations are economically devastated. They're tanking. They're having a really, really hard time, especially places like Germany. The US wants to promote a healthy economy. Again, getting at some of the things that we talked about with like what happened after World War I, directly kind of leading to World War II. We don't want the same things happening. We want to promote a healthy German economy. Regardless of who's on what side of the battle, the idea is to help the Germans rebuild and get back to some sense of normalcy, right? Didn't want to fall into the same problems with the Treaty of Versailles. Another thing that we're seeing here is that the idea is that, and that I talked about earlier, a lot of desperate nations are susceptible to fall under the influence of communism. Obviously, that's a democratic agenda there. That's a democratic statement. The U.S. sees the Soviet influence of Romania as a violation of the Declaration of Liberated Europe. They also see that sharing the Polish government between communists and non-communists is not working out at all because the Soviets are like, yeah, sure, we'll do it. And then of the 18 seats in government, only 3 of them are given to non-communists. So obviously that compromise isn't really working. There's also no sign of any sort of free election that was supposed to take place. So the idea with, all of this stuff is like, hey, we'll let you mess with Poland and do whatever for a little while until that free election comes around. Soviets are like, all right, cool. Sounds good. Time passes. Hey, where's that free election at? Still no free election. Still no free election. Also, only 3 of the people that you guys sent are going to be in the government. So, obviously there's some issues here. On top of that, it's very clear that the Soviets are disregarding a lot of the agreements put in place by the majority of the Allies in favor of their own agenda. So that's just going to further a lot of the tension during this time. That is directly going to lead to a lot of the stuff that is going to cause the Cold War. All these things are leading the U.S. and Soviets to become increasingly more hostile towards each other by the end of World War II. So this has been happening before World War II ends. We're not always on the same page with the Soviets, and then following World War II, it's kind of like, all right, do we have anything that we need to work together on? Really? No. All right, we're going to go do our own thing now. And so you see that we play nice and we work together while it favors the both of us. But as soon as the war is over, a lot of these true agendas and these true kind of intentions do come out. This is an important term, something to know. The Potsdam Conference, July 1945. So again, it's really early on, okay? We're not wasting any time. FDR's passed away by now, so it's Truman, Churchill, and Stalin. They're meeting to discuss the fate of Germany. This is another thing that's important to note. The fact that you have a transition of power in between all of this is another point of tension, right? Whether or not Stalin, had gotten to know FDR a little bit throughout the war, they probably had, more speaking points together. They had probably known each other a little bit more well than Truman, maybe. And so now Truman taking over, maybe he has a different idea or whatever, whatever it might be. The transition of power is not the major thing to focus on, but maybe it plays a role, right? It could. Stalin's determined to get the reparation payments from Germany. He's still, he's like, you owe me money, right? Stalin is looking for his rent payments, essentially, and Germany's not paying up. Stalin's looking at a lot of this stuff, and he's like, hey, I'm all in on making sure that Germany pays for the damage to my country. After all, we beat them in Stalingrad. They kind of destroyed a lot of our stuff. I'm all in on making sure that we get this money back. Truman, on the other hand, is still kind of sticking with the main ideas that we had before. He's insisting that Germany's economy has to recover in order to keep peace. That is a direct tie-in to the Treaty of Versailles. Germany's economy has to recover. There's no way to keep peace if they don't. It's also important to realize, like I said before, do keep in mind that we're not really seeing a lot of this infrastructural damage that the Soviets are seeing. So I'm going to throw them a bone there and say that I kind of understand where their irritation comes from on a lot of this stuff. I understand that they would probably want somebody else to pay for, the millions and millions of dollars of damage to their country and infrastructure, roads and buildings and cities and all these things exploding, do see that is definitely a side of it as well. So like I said before, maybe that leads to a little bit of tension because I'm sure that Stalin is looking at this and like, of course you don't care if we get our reparations because your country's fine, right? It's kind of what his thought process might be here. They do compromise, as all nations tend to do at some point. They compromise by allowing the Soviets to have industrial equipment from the other three zones of Germany in exchange for agricultural goods. Funny thing about this is that the Soviets were already doing that. They were like, all right, we're taking all of your construction equipment. And the Soviets were basically taking, I think they had already taken about 1/4 of their construction equipment, and they're basically just taking more. If you know anything about construction equipment or any sort of industrial equipment, it is really expensive. So it's not a terrible deal for the Soviets. Truman shared that the U.S.'s development of the atomic bomb was a thing, and Stalin's kind of taking that as a warning. Truman, they're in a meeting, he's like, oh, by the way, we made the atomic bomb, just so you know. And Stalin's like, okay, why are you telling me this? Like, what's your motivation? Stalin's taking it as like a threat, okay? Like, Truman's here, like, flexing on me in the meeting, basically, that he has an atomic bomb. Why are you telling me this, right? That's like if I walked up to somebody, I was like, just so you know, I have a gun. What are you going to take away from that, right? That's kind of what Stalin is seeing here. He's like, all right, why is this guy telling me he has this weapon? This conference and the outcomes of it, this is an important part. This conference is going to mark the beginning of the Cold War. So tensions have been rising. This is the first time where you're going to see an event that marks the onset of something that's going to happen for like another 50 years follow. Okay? That is the Potsdam Conference. Just a little check for understanding. Why did the U.S. want to help rebuild Europe? Which meeting is going to mark the beginning of the Cold War? What's it called? You had to look it up, didn't you? The Potsdam Conference, right? Potsdam. And then why did the U.S. want to help rebuild Europe? Part of it, is probably a U.S. agenda. You have to think again that this is, if you look at this as democratic versus communistic, the U.S. does have some motivations in doing this, right? The U.S. doesn't like communism. They don't think it's good. They think it's bad, actively hate it, right? The U.S. is probably looking at this and saying, hey, if we help to rebuild Europe, maybe we can instill some democratic, governments here. If we help out this country and we show them that this way of life works for us, then maybe they'll get on board, and we can kind of stop the Soviets from spreading a lot of that stuff. That being said, you also have the Soviets are looking at this like, what can we do to spread our agenda of communism? So you have a democratic agenda, communistic agenda, and they're kind of like, going head to head. Worry about that stuff. We talked about this the other day. What are the results of the tension between the U.S. and the USSR? This is the essential question. We might not get to a ton of this stuff today, but we'll have some of it. I just want to hit on a couple more things. I think I've got a little bit more to talk about, and then I'll give you guys the final 30 or so minutes of class, or 20 or so minutes of class to do what you got to do, whatever it might be. So looking at satellite nations. Satellite nations, these are nations that revolved around the Soviet Union, like satellites, tied to the planets that they orbit. So that's kind of a little callback to, things like Sputnik and some of the other space stuff that we're seeing at the time. It is a phrase that is coined around the time as well. These are countries like Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Hungary. This is where you see, it's almost like, the U.S. and the Allied powers, they're like, all right, our worst nightmares are coming true. Because Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, all these areas over here, they're becoming communist countries. And you can see, I think, for the most part, you're probably looking at this and you're like, here we go again, right? We just got done with Germany. We've got another power rising in Europe, and a lot of people are wary. They're hesitant. They don't entirely know what the goal is here. Why are all these countries becoming communistic, and what's the deal with Soviet Union? Why do they need control over all these places? So satellite nations, again, they're controlled by the Soviet Union. They're not allowed to create independent and democratic states in Eastern Europe. Obviously, the Allied countries who are primarily democratic or other forms of government that still range in the variability of democratic and capitalist and things like that, they're probably going to look at this and say, like, that's not great for us, right? This is spreading also very quickly, right? All these countries that before might not have been in this this kind of wellhouse of, communism are now fully on board, and whether or not they're completely with it or not, that's a different story. And some countries don't really have a choice, and that's an issue that we're seeing. These nations also, sorry, I'll go back really quick. The nations that we had are required to remain communist, and they're also required to remain friendly with the Soviet Union. They had to have policies pre-approved by the Soviets as well. So seeing this, we're seeing, the fear of communism. It spreads like fire. Many in the Allied countries are pretty worried. They think that this is going to contribute to some issues, especially with the Soviet Union gaining so much power and land. And like I said, it's kind of like one of those here we go again moments. So this is the thing that we'll end off on the Iron Curtain today. With the Iron Curtain, this is this phrase used to describe the division between the communist countries of Eastern Europe and democratic Western Europe. It's a term that is coined by Winston Churchill, right? The press picked up on the term for the next 43 years. Whenever somebody said Iron Curtain, they're basically talking about the communist countries of Eastern Europe. Churchill basically meant that the Soviet Union had created such a sharp separation between all these democratic and communistic countries that nobody really knew what was going on behind the curtain, this giant Iron Curtain. He's basically saying that there's this invisible boundary that is pretty much impenetrable, okay? So if you take a look at it, that's just, good old political cartoon. This is the Iron Curtain. So you can see, obviously, the Soviet Union is gaining a lot of momentum. They're building, they're expanding, right? And they're turning a lot of these countries communist. It originally started with, we need Poland, right? It's a good buffer state. It's good. It's a matter of life and death, says Stalin. We will literally die if we don't get Poland. And then all of a sudden, Stalin's like, and Czechoslovakia. We will die if we don't get Czechoslovakia. And maybe Hungary, and Romania, and Bulgaria, and I don't know, maybe we'll take Yugoslavia. And then, you know what, how about like Switzerland? And then, you know what, how about France? That's the idea that people are kind of seeing here. That's what they're getting worried for. Maybe one day it's, we'll die if we don't take Spain, right? That's the kind of thought process that I think a lot of allied powers and a lot of democratic countries are looking at during this time. And that'll feed into things like, when we go to Vietnam, right? We see Vietnam turning communist and we're like, oh, not again, right? Got to get in there, right? And there's a lot of things that you see, worries about communism, fear, hysteria, all these different things are kind of just a huge theme of the time. Okay, so I think we'll end. Bless you. I think we'll end here today. Let me see what else we got. So we'll end here today because we'll talk about some of this stuff tomorrow. We're already ahead of the game anyway. So I'll give you guys a little bit of free time, and we'll get through some of these things tomorrow. All right. Does anybody have any questions on anything? Anything at all? Okay. There is an exit ticket. So on the Canvas homepage, if you go, the exit ticket, what is the Cold War? Why was it a threat to the United States? We talked about this last class. One of the big things that you'll see why it's an actual threat, get away from the idea of communism, get more into the idea of nuclear war, right? For everything else, for all intents and purposes. Anybody online, do you guys have any questions for me? I'll take that as a no. All right, you guys are good to go. If you would like, make sure you do your exit ticket, and I will see you all on Wednesday.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good one.